The first light of dawn crept slowly over the jagged mountain ridges, spilling pale gold across the cold stone valley below. Mist curled between the pines like silent ghosts, and the forest was quiet in that strange moment before the world truly woke. High above the valley, a pack of dragons cut through the sky in desperate formation, their massive wings beating the air with urgency and fear. These were not the calm patrol flights the mountain folk sometimes glimpsed from afar. This was panic. 3 hatchlings, young, barely able to fly properly, had vanished during the night storm. The dragon pack had searched the mountains for hours, calling into the darkness with deep, echoing roars that shook cliffs and startled wildlife for miles. Dragons rarely lost their young. When they did, it meant tragedy. Either the storm had torn them away, or something worse had found them first. The lead dragon, a massive bronze female with scars running along her wings, let out another rumbling call that rolled across the valley like thunder. She was the alpha of the pack, and fear had twisted into something close to rage inside her chest. Hatchlings were the future of their kind. Without them, the pack would slowly fade from the mountains. Her golden eyes scanned the forest below again and again. Then she saw something strange. A faint column of smoke rising from the trees. Dragons normally avoided the scent of human fire, but this one was small, just a thin ribbon drifting lazily into the morning air. The alpha narrowed her eyes. Humans were unpredictable creatures, weak in body, yet dangerous in their strange, clever ways. But right now, desperation outweighed caution. With a sharp cry, she angled her wings downward and began descending toward the forest clearing below. The other dragons followed, gliding silently through the thinning mist until the trees opened into a small clearing beside a narrow river. In the center stood a rough wooden cabin, clearly built by human hands. Firewood was stacked neatly beside the wall, and faint smoke curled from a stone chimney. It looked peaceful. Too peaceful. The alpha landed first, her claws sinking into the damp earth with a heavy thud. The ground trembled as the rest of the pack landed around her, their wings folding carefully against their enormous bodies. The scent of humans lingered strongly here. The alpha lowered her massive head and sniffed the air. Then she froze. There it was, the unmistakable scent of dragon hatchlings. But it was mixed with something unexpected: warmth, safety, and sleep. Confused, the alpha slowly approached the cabin. Her claws made almost no sound on the soft ground despite her enormous size. The other dragons watched closely, ready to burn the clearing to ash if danger appeared. The alpha gently nudged the wooden door with the tip of her snout. Creaked open slowly. What she saw inside made her entire body go still. On the wooden floor, near a small stone fireplace, a human man sat slumped against the wall, clearly asleep. His head rested awkwardly against a wooden beam, dark circles beneath his tired eyes. A thick blanket had been draped across his shoulders sometime during the night. But that wasn't what stunned the dragons. Curled around him like tiny living embers were the 3 missing hatchlings. One lay across his lap, snoring softly with tiny puffs of smoke drifting from its nostrils. Another had tucked itself against his chest, its small wings wrapped around the man's arm like a protective hug. The smallest hatchling had fallen asleep against the human's shoulder, its little head resting beneath his chin. The human hadn't moved all night. He had simply stayed there, guarding them. The alpha stared in disbelief. Dragons were feared across the continent. Entire armies trembled when they appeared in the sky. Yet somehow, during the cold, stormy night, these hatchlings had found shelter with a lone human, and he had chosen not to harm them, not capture them, not run away. Instead, he had protected them. The alpha slowly stepped into the cabin, her enormous form nearly filling the doorway. The wooden walls creaked softly under her presence. One of the hatchlings stirred, opening sleepy eyes. When it saw the alpha, it chirped happily and wiggled free from the human's lap. The man blinked awake a second later. For a long moment, he simply stared at the enormous dragon standing inside his cabin. Most humans would have screamed, or tried to run, but this man only sighed tiredly and rubbed his eyes. Then he said something that stunned the entire dragon pack. "Oh good. You're their mother, I assume." He gently lifted the smallest hatchling from his shoulder and set it carefully on the floor. They were freezing out there in the storm, he added calmly. Figured someone had to keep them warm. The alpha dragon stared at him, golden eyes wide with shock. No human had ever spoken to a dragon like that before. Outside the cabin, the rest of the dragon pack waited in tense silence, expecting flames and chaos at any moment. Instead, what they saw next would become the beginning of a legend whispered across mountains for generations. The alpha slowly lowered her massive head and bowed to the human. For several long seconds, the small cabin remained completely silent. The human man sat on the wooden floor beside the fading fire, still rubbing the sleep from his eyes, while the enormous bronze dragon bowed her head before him. Outside, the dragon pack waited tensely, their massive shadows stretching across the clearing as the rising sun climbed slowly above the mountains. None of them understood what was happening inside the human's home. Dragons did not bow to humans. Not ever. Yet their alpha remained there, her great horned head lowered in a gesture of deep respect. The man blinked slowly, clearly confused by the sight in front of him. He looked from the dragon to the hatchlings, then back again. You don't have to do that, he muttered awkwardly, scratching the back of his neck. The smallest hatchling chirped happily and waddled toward the alpha, bumping its head against her snout. The bronze dragon lifted her head slightly and nuzzled the tiny creature with surprising gentleness. Relief flooded through her chest as she confirmed what her instincts already told her. The hatchlings were completely unharmed. No injuries, no burns, no fear scent, only warmth, and the faint smell of cooked fish. The alpha's eyes shifted back to the human. Her gaze was powerful, ancient, and intimidating enough to make seasoned warriors collapse in terror. Yet the man simply stood up slowly, stretching his stiff back after a long night on the floor. "You're welcome to take them," he said calmly. "They wandered into my camp during the storm." Poor little guys looked half frozen. He stepped aside so the hatchlings could move freely. The middle hatchling, however, didn't seem interested in leaving. Instead, it waddled back toward the man and climbed onto his boot, chirping softly as if asking for attention. The man chuckled. "Hey now, your mom's here. Don't get attached." The alpha watched this interaction carefully, her mind turning with quiet astonishment. Hatchlings were extremely sensitive to danger. Their instincts were sharp even at a young age. If this human had shown even the slightest threat during the night, the hatchlings would have panicked, hissed, or tried to escape. Instead, they trusted him. That alone spoke louder than anything else. Behind her, one of the larger dragons outside let out a low, impatient rumble. The alpha turned her head slightly toward the doorway, signaling the pack to remain calm. This human had done something very few creatures in the world had ever done. He had protected dragon young without asking for anything in return. She stepped forward slowly. The wooden floor creaked beneath her weight as she lowered her head until her golden eyes were level with the man's face. A soft wave of warm air flowed from her nostrils. The human didn't flinch. He simply folded his arms. "So, you're the boss dragon then," he said thoughtfully. "Makes sense." The alpha let out a deep, rumbling sound that echoed softly through the cabin. It wasn't a threat. It was closer to gratitude. One by one, the hatchlings waddled over to her. But before leaving, the smallest one turned back toward the man and gave a tiny squeaky roar. A small puff of smoke popped from its nose. The man laughed. Yeah. Stay warm next time." Outside the cabin, the other dragons watched with growing confusion as the alpha slowly stepped back out into the clearing. The 3 hatchlings gathered safely beneath her wings. Then something even stranger happened. Instead of immediately flying away, the alpha turned back toward the cabin door. The human was standing in the doorway now, leaning against the frame casually. The alpha studied him for a moment longer. This human lived alone in the mountains. No weapons in sight, no fear in his scent, just the smell of smoke, pine wood, and river water. A quiet guardian of the forest. Then the alpha did something that left the entire dragon pack stunned. She reached down with one massive claw and gently placed something on the ground in front of the cabin. It was a dragon scale, but not just any scale. It shimmered with deep bronze light, nearly the size of a shield, polished smooth by age and power. A gift. The human looked down at it in surprise. Thanks. The alpha spread her wings slowly, the massive motion stirring the morning mist across the clearing. The rest of the dragon pack followed her lead, lifting into the air with thunderous wing beats that shook the trees. Within seconds, they were climbing back toward the clouds. The man watched them go, arms crossed. Well, that was new, he muttered. Behind him, the cabin creaked quietly in the mountain breeze. And on the ground in front of the door, the dragon scale continued to glow softly in the morning sunlight. What the human didn't realize yet was that the scale wasn't just a gift. It was a mark. From that moment forward, every dragon in the northern mountains would know one thing. This human was under the protection of the dragon pack. And soon the entire world would learn why that mattered. The mountains returned to their quiet rhythm after the dragons disappeared into the clouds. For most people, the encounter would have been unforgettable, something to tell for the rest of their lives. But the man who lived in the small cabin simply picked up his fishing rod and walked down to the river as if nothing unusual had happened. His name was Elias, and he had spent nearly 15 years living alone in the northern wilderness. He had come to the mountains to escape the noise of the cities, the politics of kings, and the endless wars that humans seemed to create for themselves. Out here, life was simple. Fish in the river, firewood in the forest, silence in the evenings. Elias preferred it that way. Still, as he cleaned his morning catch beside the riverbank, his eyes occasionally drifted toward the large bronze dragon scale resting near his cabin door. Even from a distance, it shimmered faintly in the sunlight like a piece of living metal. Elias didn't fully understand why the dragon had left it. Maybe it was gratitude. Maybe it was something else entirely. Dragons were ancient creatures with their own strange customs, and Elias had never cared enough to study them. To him, the hatchlings had simply been 3 freezing animals that needed shelter. But miles away, high above the mountains, the dragon pack was watching. The bronze alpha glided silently along the upper winds, her massive wings barely moving as she rode the currents. Below her, the forest stretched endlessly, and in the middle of that forest sat the tiny human cabin. Her golden eyes remained fixed on it. Dragons remembered kindness, and they remembered debts. Behind her, the 3 rescued hatchlings flew clumsily beside the older dragons, occasionally drifting too low before correcting themselves. Every so often, one of them chirped excitedly and looked down toward the cabin as if trying to spot the human again. The alpha rumbled softly. Even hatchlings understood something special had happened that night. But the peaceful moment didn't last long. From the far eastern horizon, another shape appeared in the sky. At first, it was only a dark speck. Then it grew larger. The alpha's eyes narrowed. It wasn't a dragon. It was an airship. The vessel moved slowly but steadily toward the mountain valley, its massive balloon casting a shadow across the clouds. Metal armor plates covered its hull, and long harpoon cannons extended from both sides. Painted across the ship's side was a crimson crest, the mark of the Imperial Dragon Hunters. The alpha's growl vibrated through the sky. Dragon hunters rarely ventured this deep into the northern mountains. The territory was too dangerous and too remote. But when they did come, they always came for one reason: eggs, hatchlings, or dragon scales. Below, Elias was returning to his cabin with a small basket of fish when he heard the distant hum of engines. He paused. That sound definitely didn't belong in the mountains. When he stepped into the clearing, he immediately saw the shadow sliding across the ground. Elias looked up. The airship loomed above the treetops like a floating fortress. "Well," he muttered quietly, "that can't be good." The ship slowly descended, metal chains rattling as anchors dropped into the clearing with heavy thuds. Steam hissed from the engines as a group of armored soldiers began climbing down ropes. Each one carried specialized weapons, harpoons tipped with shock crystals and heavy net launchers designed specifically for capturing dragons. Their leader, a tall man with silver armor and a scar running across his cheek, stepped forward and scanned the clearing. Then his eyes landed on the bronze dragon scale. A slow smile spread across his face. "Well now," he said, kneeling beside it. "Looks like someone got very lucky." He lifted the massive scale with both hands, admiring the shimmering surface. "This belongs to a pack alpha," one of the soldiers whispered nervously. The captain nodded. "Exactly." His gaze shifted toward Elias, who was standing calmly beside the cabin door. "And that means our quiet little woodsman here has been entertaining dragons." Several soldiers immediately raised their weapons toward the cabin. Elias sighed. "Look," he said, rubbing his forehead. "I really don't want trouble." The captain chuckled. "Too late for that, friend." He pointed toward the scale. "Where are the hatchlings?" Elias shrugged. "They went home." The captain's smile disappeared. "You expect me to believe that?" Before Elias could answer, a deep sound rolled across the sky. A roar. Not one dragon. Many. Every soldier froze. The captain slowly looked upward. Dark shapes were emerging from the clouds. Dozens of them. The dragon pack had returned. And this time, they were not arriving peacefully. The Alpha led them through the clouds like a living storm, her massive wings cutting through the air as flames flickered between her teeth. Below, the airship crew stared in horror, because dragons rarely traveled in large coordinated groups. But right now, an entire dragon pack was descending directly toward them, and they looked furious. Elias glanced up at the approaching dragons, then back at the soldiers. He sighed again. "You guys picked the worst possible place to visit," he said. Above the clearing, the Alpha Dragon released another thunderous roar. This time, the mountains roared back. The dragon pack had come to defend their human guardian, and the hunters had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. The clearing fell into a terrifying silence as the shadows of the dragons swept across the ground. Wind rushed through the treetops as the dragon pack descended from the clouds like a living storm. Their wings were enormous, each powerful beat sending waves of air crashing through the forest. The Imperial Dragon hunters looked up in horror as the sky darkened with scales, claws, and fire. The Bronze Alpha led them. Her golden eyes burned with fury. The moment she saw the airship and the armed soldiers surrounding the cabin, her roar split the sky like thunder. The hunters immediately scrambled into action. "Harpoons ready!" the captain shouted. Soldiers rushed to position the heavy launchers mounted on the side of the airship while others raised shock spears toward the approaching dragons. The metal hull groaned as the engines tried to lift the vessel higher, but the anchors were still buried deep in the soil of the clearing. Then the first dragon dove came down like a falling mountain. Flames exploded across the ground as the massive creature unleashed a torrent of fire that forced the soldiers to scatter in panic. Trees ignited instantly, and the clearing filled with smoke and heat. Harpoons fired into the sky. One of them struck a younger dragon's wing, causing the creature to roar in pain as the electrified cable tightened. "Hold it down!" a hunter yelled. But the Alpha was already moving. She shot through the smoke like a bronze comet, slamming into the side of the airship with terrifying force. The metal hull shrieked under the impact as claws ripped through armor plating like paper. One of the harpoon cannons was torn free and hurled into the forest below. The hunters panicked. Dragons were dangerous, but an entire dragon pack attacking together? That was a nightmare. Flames rained from the sky as more dragons joined the assault, diving past the airship and tearing at its engines. Explosions rattled the vessel as one of the steam turbines burst into sparks. Inside the chaos, the captain spotted something unexpected. Elias, the human, was standing calmly in the middle of the clearing, right between the soldiers and the burning forest. "Grab him!" the captain ordered. Two hunters rushed forward with net launchers. But before they could fire, Elias did something none of them expected. He stepped forward and raised both hands. "Stop!" His voice echoed across the clearing. It wasn't loud enough to command an army, but somehow it carried. The Alpha Dragon, mid-dive toward the airship's command deck, suddenly twisted her wings and landed in front of Elias with a ground-shaking impact. The earth cracked beneath her claws as she lowered her massive head protectively between the human and the soldiers. Flames flickered along her teeth, The hunters froze. Elias placed a hand gently against the dragon's massive bronze snout. "Easy, big girl," he said quietly. The alpha's growl faded into a low rumble. Behind her, the rest of the dragon pack circled the sky like predators waiting for the final strike. The captain stared in disbelief. "You control them?" he demanded. Elias snorted. "No." He scratched the dragon's nose absent-mindedly. "They just trust me." The captain's expression hardened. "Dragons are weapons," he snapped. "They destroy cities, burn armies. Do you understand what kind of power you're standing next to?" Elias looked up at the alpha dragon, then back at the soldiers. "Yeah," he said calmly. "I do." The bronze dragon slowly raised her head, towering over the entire clearing. Her wings spread wide, casting a massive shadow over the hunters. Then she did something that made the soldiers' blood run cold. She stepped back, not away from Elias, behind him, like a guardian standing at her post. The rest of the dragon pack began landing one by one around the clearing, forming a massive wall of scales and wings behind the cabin. Dozens of glowing eyes stared down at the hunters. The captain's confidence finally began to crack, because it was suddenly very clear what was happening. The dragons weren't attacking randomly. They were protecting someone. Elias crossed his arms. "You've got about 30 seconds, he said calmly. The captain blinked. "For what?" Elias gestured toward the sky, where more dragons were appearing from the distant mountains, drawn by the alpha's call. "To leave." The ground trembled as another massive dragon landed behind the cabin, shaking loose snow from the mountain cliffs above. The hunters slowly lowered their weapons. For the first time since arriving in the clearing, fear crept into their eyes, because they were no longer facing wild dragons. They were facing a dragon pack defending their chosen human. And that was something no hunter in history had ever survived. The clearing had become a battlefield without a single strike being thrown. Flames crackled in the nearby trees where the earlier attack had scorched the forest, smoke drifting lazily through the cold mountain air. The airship creaked overhead, one of its engines sputtering after the alpha's devastating strike. Around the cabin, dragons stood like ancient statues, massive, silent, and absolutely terrifying. Their wings were half spread, claws sunk deep into the soil, eyes glowing like embers in the morning light. And at the center of it all stood Elias. The hunters were frozen where they stood. A dozen weapons were still aimed in different directions, but none of them dared pull the trigger. The captain's confident expression had slowly drained away as more dragons continued to arrive from the distant mountain peaks. What had begun as a simple expedition to harvest dragon scales had turned into something far worse. An entire dragon pack had chosen a side, and it wasn't theirs. The captain wiped sweat from his brow and glanced toward the damaged airship. Could still fly, but not for long. If the dragons decided to attack again, the vessel wouldn't survive another strike. Still, pride and greed were powerful forces. The captain slowly straightened. "You expect us to walk away?" he said coldly. Elias shrugged. "That'd be the smart option." The captain's eyes hardened. "We came for dragons, and we're not leaving empty-handed." Before anyone could react, he reached for a small device on his belt and slammed his hand down on it. A loud metallic clang echoed across the clearing. From the belly of the airship, a heavy iron cage suddenly dropped open. Inside it was an egg, a massive dragon egg, its shell shimmering faintly with golden patterns. The alpha dragon's entire body went rigid. A low, earth-shaking growl rolled from her chest. Every dragon in the clearing reacted instantly. Wings flared, teeth bared. Flames flickered dangerously along their jaws. The hunters had captured an egg. Elias stared up at the cage, his expression darkening for the first time since the confrontation began. "You idiots," he muttered. The captain smirked. "We found it 3 days ago in the eastern cliffs," he said proudly. "Worth a king's ransom once we bring it back." The alpha stepped forward, her claws cracking the ground with each movement. The rage in her golden eyes was no longer controlled. The air itself seemed to vibrate with the fury of the dragon pack. Because dragon eggs were sacred, No creature in the world touched them without consequences. The hunters lifted their weapons again. "Stay back!" the captain shouted. "One wrong move and this egg falls straight to the ground." The cage door hung open over the clearing, suspended by chains. One cut cable would send the egg crashing dozens of feet onto the rocks below. The dragons froze. Even the alpha hesitated. Elias sighed heavily. Then he began walking forward. The hunters stared at him in confusion. "Stop right there!" one of them shouted. Elias ignored him. He walked calmly toward the airship, stepping between two enormous dragons whose heads followed his movement carefully. The alpha lowered her head slightly, watching him, trusting him. Elias stopped directly beneath the hanging egg. He tilted his head and examined the chains holding the cage. "Yeah," he said thoughtfully. "That's about what I figured." The captain frowned. "What are you talking about?" Elias looked up at him. "You damaged your engine when you tried to take off earlier," he said. "Your lift system's unstable." The captain blinked. "And," Elias gestured toward the balloon above, "if you don't drop that extra weight soon, your airship's going to crash." The hunters glanced nervously at each other. Right on cue, the damaged engine sputtered violently. The entire airship lurched sideways. Chains rattled. The egg swung dangerously over the clearing. The captain grabbed the railing. "Stabilize the engines," he shouted. But it was already too late. Another loud metallic snap echoed through the valley. One of the support chains holding the cage had just broken. The egg tilted sharply toward the open door. The alpha roared in panic. But Elias moved first. With a speed that shocked everyone watching, he grabbed a nearby rope attached to the cargo system and leapt onto a supply crate hanging beneath the airship. The crate swung wildly as he climbed upward toward the dangling cage. Below him, dozens of dragons watched in stunned silence. The hunters were too shocked to even fire their weapons. Elias reached the cage just as the second chain began to snap. He grabbed the egg with both arms. The shell was warm and far heavier than he expected. "All right," he muttered through clenched teeth. "Let's not drop you." Below, the alpha dragon spread her wings and moved directly beneath him, ready to catch them if he fell. Above, the final chain snapped. The cage collapsed. For one terrifying moment, Elias and the dragon egg were falling through the air. Then the alpha surged upward like a bronze hurricane. Her massive wings beat once, and she caught them both. The clearing erupted into thunderous roars as the dragon pack surrounded her protectively. Elias carefully lowered the egg onto the ground beside the alpha's claws. He stepped back and brushed dust from his jacket. The captain stared in complete disbelief. The dragons weren't attacking the human. They were protecting him. The alpha lowered her head beside Elias once more. Her golden eyes filled with something deeper than gratitude now. Respect. Behind them, the rest of the dragon pack began advancing toward the hunters. Slowly, relentlessly, Elias glanced over his shoulder at the terrified soldiers. Then he sighed. "You really should have taken the 30 seconds. For a long moment, no one moved. The mountain clearing stood frozen between two very different worlds. On one side stood the Imperial Dragon Hunters, armed, trained, and suddenly very aware that none of their weapons mattered anymore. On the other side stood the Dragon Pack, their massive bodies forming a living wall of scales, wings, and fire. The ground trembled beneath their weight as more dragons continued landing along the ridges surrounding the valley. At the center of it all stood Elias. Beside him rested the rescued dragon egg, its golden shell glowing faintly in the morning light. The alpha dragon lowered her massive head beside it, curling her enormous body protectively around both the egg and the quiet human who had just risked his life to save it. The hunters stared in stunned silence. They had come expecting beasts. What they had found instead was loyalty. The captain slowly backed toward the airship's boarding rope, his armor clinking with each cautious step. His confident smirk had vanished completely now, replaced by something much more honest. "Fear. Everyone back to the ship," he ordered quietly. No one argued. The soldiers lowered their weapons one by one, moving slowly and carefully as they retreated toward the ropes dangling from the damaged airship above. Every step they took felt heavy under the watchful gaze of dozens of dragons. The Alpha's golden eyes followed them. She did not attack, but the low rumble in her chest made it very clear that she could end them all in seconds if she wished. Elias watched the hunters climb the ropes back toward their airship. Some of them looked down nervously, clearly expecting a blast of dragon fire at any moment. But none came. Once the final soldier reached the deck, the captain grabbed the railing and looked down at the clearing one last time. His eyes landed on Elias. "I don't understand you," he admitted. Elias shrugged. "Most people don't." The captain glanced at the dragons surrounding the valley. Why would they trust a human? Elias thought for a moment. Then he simply said, "Because I never tried to own them." For a few seconds, the captain said nothing. Then he gave a short, bitter laugh. "Maybe the Empire has been wrong about more than just dragons." He turned toward his crew. "Cut the anchors." Heavy chains dropped away from the ground as the damaged airship struggled back into the sky. One of its engines sputtered violently, but slowly the vessel began rising above the treetops. The hunters were leaving, not defeated by weapons, but by something they had never expected: trust. The airship drifted farther into the sky until it disappeared behind the mountain clouds. Only then did the tension in the clearing begin to fade. The dragons relaxed their wings, some settling onto the ground while others returned to the sky in wide circling patterns above the valley. Elias stretched his shoulders and let out a long breath. "Well," he muttered, "that was a lot more excitement than I usually get before lunch." The Alpha Dragon lowered her enormous head until her golden eyes were level with him. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. Then something remarkable happened. The Alpha gently nudged the dragon egg toward Elias. He blinked. I think that belongs to you." The Alpha gave a soft rumbling sound. Behind her, the 3 small hatchlings from the night before ran forward excitedly, chirping and flapping their tiny wings as they gathered around the egg. It took Elias a second to understand. The Alpha wasn't giving him the egg. She was trusting him with it. The dragons believed the valley, and the quiet human who lived there, was the safest place in the mountains. Elias rubbed the back of his neck. "You know," he said slowly, "I was planning on spending today fixing my fishing net." The hatchlings chirped louder, clearly ignoring his concerns. The Alpha gave a satisfied rumble. Elias sighed. "Well, I guess the cabin's going to need a bigger porch." The sun rose higher over the mountains as the dragon pack slowly settled around the valley. Some perched along the cliffs, others rested near the river, their enormous wings folding peacefully. The clearing that once held a lonely cabin was no longer quiet. It had become something else entirely, a sanctuary. Days later, rumors began spreading across distant kingdoms and trading cities. Stories of an entire dragon pack living peacefully in the northern mountains. Stories of hunters fleeing in terror. And most unbelievable of all, stories of a single human who walked among dragons as if they were family. Travelers eventually gave him a name. Not a king, not a warrior, but something far rarer: the Guardian of Dragons. Back in the quiet mountain valley, Elias sat on his porch watching the hatchlings chase each other across the grass, while the Alpha Dragon slept peacefully nearby. He sipped his morning tea and shook his head. Guess retirement didn't go exactly as planned. One of the hatchlings climbed onto the porch and curled up beside his chair. Elias smiled faintly and scratched the tiny dragon behind the horns. Far above them, the dragon pack soared across the sky. And for the first time in centuries, dragons and humans shared the same home in peace. "Dragon,"